Okay, thanks, Rose. And thanks to everybody for coming here today. The campus is so quiet on Reading Week. It's nice to see some individuals around. Okay, so look, I'm just really excited about this research. And it's kind of very much ongoing. We're at a very kind of early stage with this. So there's a health warning with what you're going to see, okay? I'm not trying to convince you that this is necessarily describing reality, but it's a fun exploration that's pretty novel, and I think, and showing some new things about some old ideas. So let me just dive in. The motivation for this is, is what I kind of see when I look at, the holy grail of economic history being the origin of economic growth during the Industrial Revolution. But we also have, lots of other changes happening. We have the Enlightenment, we have the Scientific Revolution, and these things are kind of happening more or less, not in the right order necessarily, but they're happening in the broad kind of from a millennium perspective, kind of around the same time. And what this is kind of showing, I think, is that behavior is changing, okay, amongst our species at the individual level over the past 1,000 years. And that's what gives us these events that we use to define the modern world, okay? And so we have this kind of interdisciplinary wave of research that's basically pinpointing different aspects of this, okay? And so this kind of can be shown whether you have wages or income per person, from over the long run, just shooting up during the Industrial Revolution, the demographic transition in terms of people having smaller family sizes and death being a much reduced part of human life, and the fact that we're all living longer lives, okay? And what's interesting about this is that there are kind of, lots of kind of, comorbidities, if you will, in the sense of being literacy is rising over the long run, as violence is declining over the long run too. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of these behavioral changes at the population level are foreshadowed by behavioral changes amongst elite groups as well. You can see this in terms of my own work on lifespan of European elites. Again, over the past 1,000 years, again around 1600, you see an uptick. You can see this also for violence amongst aristocrats, okay? That's starting to decline as well over time. And we could see that in terms of homicide rates, from other work as well. And you also see this amongst family sizes, okay? Something so fundamental about having a large or small family, that's also changing over the long run. That's changing in our populations, but also foreshadowed by the behavior of elites as well. So when you look at the relative timing of these behavioral changes, you see a social gradient, if you will, okay? And what is interesting about this is that if you were looking at individual level data and trying to find the origin of this, you would slice it up and look from the top of society, and look down, okay? So with that in mind, I want to look at reconstructing in far greater resolution than we've been able to before, the economic, social history and psychological history of the English, okay? And to do this at scale in a big way. And how I do this is by using wills, okay? So for most of the past 1,000 years, wills have been this popular legal device that have guided the direction of a person's assets upon their death, okay? And they're actually much longer than 1,000 words. Actually, like the crunched into the numbers on a sample, actually it's often about 2,000 to 3,000 words. And typically they form, there's patterns of expression that you see amongst these, but there's also revelations about sentiment, okay? And I'm going to try and show you some of that today. But before we get to that, it's just that these are even though they're going to be more likely to be left by richer people, they're still our most democratic record of the individual lives of our ancestors, okay? There are millions of these documents and they permeate the social order quite deeply. Now, the very poorest aren't leaving wills, but like the fact that they're not leaving a will is going to be something that's going to be looked at here. Okay, so there are millions of these things, and I'm trying to kind of collect these things together. But what we've got what I'm going to show you today is a sample of around 22,000. So what's making this possible is that for many generations, these wills have been catalogued and photographed by archives. And now we're in a position where we can take these images and crunch them through, optical character recognition engines and get the full text of these wills, okay? So this is kind of exciting to kind of give you like a kind of feel for this. This is a will from a random individual that I picked at random. I'll say random 3 times, listing this man's 2 surviving daughters, and all these various, like a lot of like interesting detail. And this is just, one kind of table that can be extracted from one will. The idea is to do this for everyone. And you can look at average wealth over time, you can look at inequality, you can also look at like who's getting what, and you can see some interesting kind of nuances in terms of Thomas Combe being given a sword. The giving of a knife to someone is often considered quite taboo in some cultures. But I just look at this last bequest. This is to a man who didn't name his wife, just said to my wife, my second best bed with all the furniture, okay? So this is you know who this is. This is the will of William Shakespeare, okay? So Shakespeare did not name his wife in his will, okay? And scholars debate what he meant by the second best bed. We're not going to debate that here today. Suffice to say, the fact that he didn't name her hints that he wasn't too warm towards her. So what you can use in these documents are testaments of individuals' affection towards people in their lives, okay? And so Shakespeare, in terms of a quantitative sentiment score, scores a big fat 0 in terms of his love for his wife, okay? And so what's really interesting is that you can measure this in terms of quantitative sentiment. He doesn't describe her in any way, so it's just a 0. Okay, but you can also look at the second best bed. Let's price that. What percentage of his estate is that? It's a pretty vanishingly small percentage of his estate. So you've got real and nominal measures of affection. And so the idea is I've got this pipeline, it's a data thing, but doing this quantitatively for literally millions of people is the kind of idea here. And when you think about it, this is just one slice of the data. So I want to show you some kind of experiments that I've done with a pilot study of this idea. And this is from 22,000 will transcripts that I've managed to collect. They're already digitized. And so what's interesting, you get more coverage over time, but there's good coverage for, maybe 1450, 1500. You can say something. You've got a few hundred, maybe 1,000 before 1600. And this is a word cloud, okay? And this kind of really reinforces the point that these documents are legal pro forma documents in the main that direct assets at death. But basically within them, okay, they're not like psychological profiles where someone sits on a couch and they go through, poetically all the things that really matter to them in their life. But these people are contemplating their death, okay, and they're deciding where their assets are going. So what can we do with this data? So what's interesting, this is the distribution of sentiment, okay? Now I've just done default libraries based on modern dictionaries where if I say I love you, that's +1 in sentiment. If I say I hate you, that's 0. If I say nothing, that's going to be Shakespeare about his wife, 0 in the middle, okay? And you see that there is there is this kind of distribution that you can pick out here in terms of positive, negative, and net sentiment. And what's interesting about this is that this is kind of changing over time, and this could be anything. People are becoming more emotional, perhaps, or maybe people are just becoming, there's more flourish in language, okay, as a fashion, per se. But we can do some things with this. What's interesting about it is, and this is just like throwing this out there, you can read these wills and code them for wealth. And I've done this in other projects, but just using the word count for this sample and just looking how sentiment varies, you can see, these kind of, these cross-country studies of GDP and happiness tend to show a very steep relationship at low levels of GDP that flattens out. And yeah, there you go. It's in the will data as well. If you're very, very poor, you're not happy, but then it kind of levels off and then goes slightly negative. I think I could kind of do a lot more with that, obviously. But there are really simple signals from this data that tell us about individual behavior and culture. For example, religion, okay? How likely are you to mention God, okay? And even more sensitive, how in a Christian country, how likely are you to mention Jesus, okay? As you can see, this is rising over time and then declining, okay? And remember, we can split this up into the cross section, look at religiosity and fertility, religiosity and happiness. So lots of nice little experiments, I think, that can be done with the data. One thing that's been shown by other work, and it's a good thing to kind of anchor this work in earlier work, is the decline of individual level charity. This is just how many people are giving bequests to the poor. And you can see it's quite popular in the 15th, 16th century, and then declines secularly as you go through the modern world. So what I was most excited to kind of show you today was some work on this idea of affection between spouses. There is historical work that suggests that romantic love is actually a quite recent phenomenon, okay, perhaps of the 17th century. So scholars such as Lawrence Stone point to this fact. And it's one of these, I think, potential kind of other aspects of behavioral change. So this is, again, just a quick and dirty empirical exercise. I go through all of those word clouds, okay, 22,000 wills, and you find the adjective immediately preceding wife. So could it be their wife, my lovely wife, my hateful, spiteful wife, who I give nothing to, which doesn't happen that often. But basically, you can see that blue line at the bottom. You can see that people are very rarely negative. Sometimes they are, but you can see here that there's a really strong rise in this, and that's happening around 1600, where you get that trend just rising up. And we can compare that to say, husbands. Women leave wills, and that's what I want to talk about. That's what we'll finish on. But they're far less expressive of positive emotion, right? And if you look at the scale here, remember the scale. If this was like a love poem, should be scoring +1. If it was just I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, that should be -1. And so look at the scale here. Like men are 0.15 out of 1 in a legal document. So that's a pretty strong signal. But it's 0.06 here is the top of the scale for women describing their husband. And you can get like all sorts of sentiments towards sons. Again, you're getting a rise. And then also daughters. But you can see that if for men anyway, the person where they show the most negative sentiment is towards their daughters, okay, if it appears at all. And I think Shakespeare, I don't think it's necessarily in the will, but it's well known that he disapproved of his daughter's marital choice, So that's interesting. But like the kind of weakness here, and I'm sure that you're being skeptical, which is what you should be. But I mean, it could just be that this is just a fashion of language. There's a flourish. You say my loving wife because, everybody says it, okay? Okay, so it's interesting that language is changing and becoming more expressive, but it's not measuring anything real. It's kind of a nominal fashion-based change. Well, here's a little kind of direct kind of attempt to kind of control for that. And the idea here is that language could be shifting up and down, but there should be a common trend to how people speak about everyone, okay? And if you just gender it and you think about daughters and wives for men, and you look at the ratio of how men speak about their wives relative to how they speak about their daughters, my argument is that should isolate the romantic love component. And here is where you get a very powerful result from this pilot study. So what's interesting for the 1500 period, before here the data is just too weak. People are just not talking about people so much, so I don't get much to work with. But around 1500, what you find is that people actually speak much more positively about their daughters than their wives. The wives are just not spoken about in any positive way. And then you get to around 1550 and you start to see something happening here where there is some disproportionate affection being shown in these wills towards wives. And then suddenly by 1600, you're getting this ratio of 10 to 1 in terms of the sentiment score for the adjective before wife and daughter. So I think that's a really intriguing possibility that you can track in these documents where you think specific affection, at least at the end of people's lives, is appearing in these documents. So I thought that was pretty exciting. Suffice to say, it does seem to be declining since then as well. But what you want to do here is slice this up. Okay, look at different cross sections, look at how the sample is changing over time. So there's all these different kind of extensions you can make. And I think this is just a raw average. You can do a lot more here. Okay, so that's some of the kind of fun sentiment stuff. Before I finished, I wanted to show you something a little bit more obvious and concrete. And this is the first paper from this project. And this is just trying to get a time series for the relative economic status of women to men in England over, say, the past 8 centuries. And this was where I was preparing for this project. I collected many millions of will indices with individual names. And I realized that you could just look at the names in these will indices and look at the proportion female over time as just a blunt, possibly quite ugly, violent kind of slice to just see where are women in terms of being wealth holders. And that's it. It's maybe too simplistic. And of course, there's a whole background here. But in economic history, we have very little to describe the position of women, say, over the long run. We have wages for servant women. That's the best we can do. But I think the proportion of women holding some wealth at all is just another viewpoint of how women are doing over time, because there are many debates here. There are many debates that are central to the field of economic history concerning the Black Death, and also the kind of when do we see this turning point in female wealth holding? Does it precede or follow, say, kind of the social movements of the 19th century? So I've got a very kind of simple takeaway. This is coming from many millions of records. These are for elites. And here we only get it from 1400, the elite will in this index of the prerogative court of Canterbury. And you're seeing that women are about 10% of all wealth holders in this index. And then around 1600, it starts to rise, okay? For the county series, which is a much more middle class measure, okay, as opposed to saying being the top 1% for the PCC. We actually have data going back to the 1300s. Okay, and this is nice because the Black Death plays this strong role in narratives that we have in economic history. The data is noisy, but we just smooth that out. Again, this is violent. But you see that there's really no kind of dramatic impact of the Black Death on female status. If anything, it's kind of slightly declining. And then again, you see this rise after 1600. And this is just some more recent work looking in from London, from a very early source, the London Court of Hustings, from 1250 to 1450. So very exciting to be able to go back this far. But again, the period of the Black Death is not causing any dramatic change in terms of that average of 10% of women that show up as wealth holders. So I think this is all very kind of parsimonious, both these kind of sentiment and exploring the women as wealth holders. There's obviously a lot more that can be said. I just wanted to give you a quick overview, but it's intriguing in the sentiment stuff and the female status stuff, that basically you're getting a turning point around 1600 that also corresponds to those behavioural changes that I introduced at the start of the talk. And so what's interesting about it, for say the kind of the female status stuff, is that I think that it's showing that, if anything, the kind of later 19th century social movements might be kind of, reflections of something that's happening at the bottom of society. Okay, they're not top-down changes. And the coincidence of this is something I've mentioned as well. But I think that once you start diving into these documents as records, as very sensitive records of what's actually going on inside people's heads, I think you can get a far greater resolution picture of all of these changes that basically create the modern world, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now, and thanks for listening.